Hello and welcome to another episode of the SureTech Podcast InfoSec with the three Hacketeers. And the three Hacketeers we have today are myself, Sid, Josh, and we are joined by Ryan today. If Jose can jump on, he will jump in when he can. But if he can't, he cannot. So today we're going to be talking about NIST compliance and cybersecurity and how they are not the same thing. Cybersecurity does not guarantee that you're NIST compliant, and being NIST compliant does not mean that you have good cybersecurity within your environment for your organization. So let's jump it off here. I'll give you a quick overview. We'll hand it over to Josh. What does it mean to be NIST compliant? Compliance often is met via checklists and checking boxes and doing whatever these check boxes require you to do so that you can actually successfully check box them. Compliance to external standards only deals with the risks and vulnerabilities identified by the external entity. So I just want to unpack that real quick. When we talk about any form of compliance, and today we're talking about NIST, it's an external standard. And an external standard is you have a company, you have an organization. It's not your standard, it's an external standard. And compliance to that external standard only deals with the risks and vulnerabilities that are identified by that external entity. It's not identified by you, it's identified by them, which is cool because it gives a good jumping point, a good starting point. It could be the end all be all, and it might not be the end all be all, but it's a good thing to have in the greater world. So the first question I want to kick over to Josh is, what does it mean to be cyber secure?
Sure. And I guess, just to preface at the beginning of this episode, do not take what I'm about to say and think that I'm saying you shouldn't be NIST compliant or you shouldn't ever adhere to an external security compliance framework. That's not what I'm saying. But when we talk about cybersecurity, what we're talking about and what it means for you to be cyber secure is that your environment, your IT infrastructure is secure against the risks and the vulnerabilities that are present in your environment. So an external standard, they might talk about risks, vulnerabilities that aren't present in your environment, right? That don't map. Real basic example, that NIST talks a lot about wireless security controls for like Wi-Fi. Well, if you don't have Wi-Fi, you don't have that risk and vulnerability. So that's great. That's easy. Also means that there might be things that you do have that the external standard might not address. A big example of this right now might be cloud security, like what security controls you have for a cloud environment that's connected to your environment, but external to your environment. Sometimes, with NIST, you might not see, depending on the framework you're working on, or even some of the other frameworks, you might not see a lot of cloud security controls, right? They're not explicit. They might be there, but they're not explicitly called out the way other controls are called out. So when we're talking about cybersecurity, we're not talking about just the fact that you meet all the boxes in a NIST framework, but that you've actually achieved the goal of being entirely secure.
One thing I think to really drive the point home and kind of summarize is NIST compliance is a static, stable target, whereas cybersecurity in general is an ever-moving, ever-changing target. NIST compliance can be just make sure you have A through Z done, boom, you're NIST compliance. Whereas cybersecurity, there's constantly evolving threats. There's constant changes to the landscape of it. It's kind of like saying, adhere to this diet and you'll have a healthy lifestyle. Well, no. This is just one part of it, and it's going to be different for everyone. But by doing just X, and in this case it's NIST compliant, doesn't mean you achieve Y, which is being cyber secure. So, like I said, customization for each individual infrastructure, each individual network is going to be completely different based on case by case, which isn't really covered by NIST standards. NIST standards is, okay, A through Z, do that, you're NIST compliant. But like Josh said, point number C or letter C might not affect you, or it might not apply to you, or letter K in this compliance and in the list of things you need to do might not be enough. It might be enough for NIST compliance, but it might not be enough for your network to be fully secure. So that's kind of what we mean by the overall theme of NIST compliance does not equal cybersecurity as a whole.
And just to add on to that too, while saying all that, I do want to make sure we note that we know that NIST 800-171 does cover a ton. NIST in general covers a ton. It's a great place it's a great standard to adhere to, even if it is your only standard. But at the same time, external standards may not address risks and vulnerabilities present in your environment. Josh, do you have any examples that you might be able to give on that specific statement that external standards may not address risks and vulnerabilities present in your environment?
One thing, you brought up 171, which is a great standard, and it's great for implementing because it's got specific controls. You go down the list. What I'm really cautioning people against is complacency, that just because they checked all the boxes, that meant everything was done. One thing that, particularly the 171 compliance, since you brought it up, doesn't address a whole lot of would be email, phishing attempts, phone phishing attempts, kind of the social engineering side of cybersecurity. There's no real control that explicitly calls out, a kind of anti-phishing. There's one like security training control that just is kind of high level, says make sure you have the training that you need, but it doesn't tell you what you need. So you might check the box, I had security training, but you never did social engineering security training. So you checked the box because you did it, you were compliant, but you missed an element just because somebody didn't think of it. I brought up, the cloud security earlier. If you have a cloud system, that's really kind of where I'm driving to, is that it's not so much that the framework has gaps in it, but that if all you do is go through and tick the boxes, you're going to have gaps because you're going to miss places where you should have applied a framework control, just because you're just checking the boxes, right? You're just going down, tick the boxes. One thing that NIST and both 171, 53, and even the cybersecurity framework all run off of is risk assessments. That's what drives them. And when they write 171, when they write 53, the way that that's done is via risk assessments. They have a huge risk assessment that they do. They see what's high risk basically for everybody, and they craft controls to address those risks. And then they tell you, both 53 and 171 tell you to do a risk assessment. Cybersecurity framework is entirely driven by the risk assessment. They tell you to do a risk assessment. You can check the box, I did a risk assessment, and have done a horrible risk assessment that missed risks to your organization. That's going to be an example right there where you're compliant. I did a risk assessment, but you didn't uncover your own gaps, and then you're not cyber secure. So you met the requirement, but you didn't meet the goal. Another example is just implementation side of things. A lot of NIST and other both 171, 53, and the cybersecurity framework, just to call it those three, are a lot of they're process driven, right? It's about performing processes, repeatable action, repeatable outcomes, standardization. You might build a process and you might document a process and check the box. I have the process that NIST tells me to have. That doesn't mean that you're performing the process correctly. And by correctly, I mean that you're achieving the goal of the process. Maybe it's a security review process, right? Before somebody makes changes to your IT systems, there's some kind of review process. Most of the time, those processes are not self-enforcing, right? Somebody has to stay on top of that and manage it. And if it's not managed properly, you're going to have IT people out there fixing IT help desk calls or installing and configuring computers or software that's not undergoing review processes. And you're going to introduce, security gaps because it's not being managed correctly. Someone's listening to this and they're hearing me say this and they say, well, that means that you're not NIST compliant because you're not correctly implementing the process control. To which I'm going to say, exactly. That's 100% correct. That's the point. You can't just check the boxes. You have to actually fully implement the mature processes. Anyone going to push back? Anyone going to say, if I've done this compliance, I'm 100% secure?
Certainly not going to say that.
And again, just to completely be fully transparent, I love NIST. I use the NIST publications extensively. I fully am on board with people being NIST compliant. I just want them to do it right.
I think not only is it a good start for cybersecurity, but it's also a good way for someone who's not exactly in the space of cybersecurity to say, okay, why are they asking me for X, Y, and Z? Why do they want me to do A, B, and C? And maybe from there they can start to understand the bases that need to be covered in cybersecurity as a whole.
Yeah, exactly. Or even something that comes up with the 171 framework is this FIPS idea, which is the Federal Information Protection Standard. For those of you who don't know, one of the problems with FIPS and being federally validated is that the process takes time, right? So you're not using cutting edge, definitely not using bleeding edge, and you're not using cutting edge technology. These things are older algorithms, cryptographic algorithms, older cryptographic hardware. But the advantage is that they've been validated. They've been checked for certain vulnerabilities and they're secure. So like if you're with the 171 space, if you have to follow that compliance, they're going to tell you, hey, your cryptography has to be FIPS. One of the pushbacks on it is that because some of this technology is older, some of these cryptographic algorithms, some of these cryptographic, hardware and software components are more vulnerable to, say, brute forcing or to being cracked, that there's been decryption algorithms that have improved the speed at which somebody can decrypt. And you're better off using a newer algorithm. But you can't because the newer algorithm isn't FIPS, right? So that's an example of somewhere where there's tension, where the NIST compliance is telling you explicitly to use a particular form of technology that there are possibly, I don't want to say there definitely or probably, but there's definitely possibly better technology out there. That's probably the number one in the 171 sphere. It's probably the number one point of tension that shows that just because it's compliant doesn't mean it's secure, and just because it's secure doesn't mean that it's compliant.
I can be the voice of reason to say that, yes, that can be very annoying. But with that, with that being said, blindly following checklists may result in a compliant result, but not achieving the goal of compliance, which is security, right? The ultimate goal of being compliant to an external standard is security, which is why we're talking about this in the first place, we want everybody to be secure. So if you are trying to go and adhere to a specific compliance standard, our message is it's not the end all be all. It might be, but it probably isn't. Josh alluded to earlier how NIST 800 171 kind of doesn't have a specific control for social engineering training. At the time of recording of this podcast, MGM Hotels got hacked. Anybody can go look up the article or articles that are out there about them. They got hacked via social engineering and they got ransomed. So that is definitely still a very prevalent use case for what we're talking about here. That's a prevalent example of a humongous entity, being MGM Hotels, somehow, some way let that go through. According to the articles that I'm reading, it took these hackers 10 minutes to get access to what they needed to get access to, or at least open the door, I should say. Like, that's ridiculous. Just 10 minutes. I'm sitting here laughing about it. It's not really a laughing matter, but that's how good they are at social engineering. And if that's not because it's not addressed by the NIST 800 171 controls, it is our recommendation to consider putting it in your own cybersecurity controls, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. That's part of the whole training thing.
But it goes back to the alignment, right? The note of any misalignments with your specific environment, right? Any compliant organization could still have some misalignments of whatever the compliance standard they're trying to meet versus their environment. There could still be some misalignments, right? So,
yeah, I think people need to understand that compliance, and we're talking about NIST compliance a lot in this podcast, but for any compliance effort, that should be taken as the ground floor. That's the beginning. And you're going to need to move beyond what there is in just a compliance framework to truly be secure. And the other thing that we haven't touched on is why. Why is there a control? And that's something that can have huge security implications. This happens a lot. I see this all the time in compliance when I'm doing an audit and I come across a control, something that a security person has implemented, and the end user is like, why do I have to do this? MFA is a big one that everyone hates. Why do I have to do MFA? Why do I have to log in to this secure portal and use this crazy password? And then I have this restricted access. I can only do 3 things. Why is it locked down so much? And they don't want to do it. It's compliant. It's meeting whatever external framework or internal requirement there is, but people don't understand why. They don't know why it's there. And they spend all their time trying to work around it because it just bothers them. This I say workaround. Immediately bells should be going off for people like it's not secure. Users just need to, they just need to follow the rules. You got to explain to people like this is why, and depending on how sensitive something is, or how onerous it is, or where that person's rank is in the totem pole, how much detail you have to go into about why they have to do this security control, particularly when you're putting things out to management and when to change how your team does things. Why does my team have to do this? It's an external control that NIST says you have to do this. Nobody likes that, right? That's being told you can't have a cookie before dinner. Well, why can't I have a cookie before dinner? I want to have a cookie before dinner. Well, it's going to ruin your appetite. It's bad security. That's where this whole alignment thing comes in. It to my way of thinking is you're not doing the control just because NIST tells you to do the control, right? That's compliance. You're doing the control because it improves your security. That's cybersecurity. So if a control is just there to check a box, it's not going to give you cybersecurity because no one's going to properly follow it, properly implement it, properly see where it ends, the explicit wording of the control ends, and the security goal begins. So that's my take, is when you're doing this compliance, you got to look, what is this control for? How is this control helping me with security? And how do I implement this to improve security? And who do I have to explain this to, right? Who's the speed bump that's going to try and divert this control that I need to explain how this is helping them, how it's helping the company and the organization? And where do I have to go beyond? Where does the control fall short in my environment that I need to add another layer, go a little further, do more training, bring in, an expert? That's my 2 cents.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the SureTech Podcast. If you found value in what you listened to today, please give us a like. Do follow us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. In the description, there will be a link tree that will take you to our social media pages, and you can keep up with us on your favorite social media platform. If you'd like to get in touch with us here at SureTech, please email us at info@sure-technologies.com, which is also in the description. Thanks again, and see you on the next one.